The very beginning of Prometheus Rising opens like a riddle designed to destabilize certainty. Robert Anton Wilson does not ask us to agree with his thesis. He demands that we see through the illusion of agreement itself. He famously states, "What the thinker thinks, the prover proves." It is not just a clever phrase, but a foundational warning. Your mind's logic engine, the prover, does not operate on independent evidence. It serves whatever your thinker already believes. This is the paradox that initiates the reader into the labyrinth that Prometheus Rising will become. You are not a neutral observer. You are a biological system addicted to coherence, addicted to the self-confirming loop of belief and evidence. Wilson illustrates this loop elegantly, provocatively pointing out that both conspiracy theorists and scientists, racists and egalitarians, zealots and atheists alike, are all living under this same neurological law. Whatever the thinker thinks, the prover proves. A person who believes the world is out to get them finds evidence of persecution everywhere. A person convinced they are lucky sees confirmation of their good fortune in the smallest serendipities. What Wilson underscores is not that beliefs are wrong or right, but that belief structures filter perception itself. What you see is determined by what you think you will see. This is not an abstract philosophical exercise. It is a biological reality. Wilson brings in the work of Timothy Leary and others to argue that the human brain is not a static reasoning machine, but a biocomputer shaped by conditioning. The hardware is the same for all of us, but the software, our learned models, beliefs, prejudices, hopes, is utterly idiosyncratic and self-reinforcing. And here is where the disturbing core of this chapter becomes clear. Our neurological equipment ensures that we rarely challenge our programming unless we are forced to do so. Wilson warns that most humans live as if their subjective interpretations are objective truths, unaware that the mind itself bends reality around these internal programs. To understand this properly, Wilson invites us to imagine ourselves as scientists observing the mind as an experiment. The thinker generates thoughts, ideas, suspicions, hopes, fears. The prover, faithful like a lawyer, gathers evidence to substantiate whatever has been put forward. This feedback loop creates a self-perpetuating reality tunnel. We do not live in an objective world, but inside the confines of our programmed tunnel, interpreting events only in ways that keep the tunnel intact. This is a deeply subversive insight, and Wilson does not shy away from emphasizing its radical nature. He tells us that most human conflict, prejudice, war, politics, and ideology boil down to people living in separate reality tunnels and mistaking them for shared reality. The thinker is convinced of a truth, and the prover obediently confirms it. And from there, the human animal acts as if this circular feedback is absolute fact. But Wilson takes it further. This condition is not simply an individual phenomenon. It is social, cultural, and historical. Whole civilizations develop collective reality tunnels. The mythologies of the ancients, the dogmas of medieval religion, the ideologies of modern nation-states, and even the paradigms of science itself are all, according to Wilson, products of thinker-prover loops on a civilizational scale. And just as individuals fail to recognize their personal programming, so too do societies fail to recognize their collective reality tunnels. Wilson's project, then, is nothing less than revolutionary: to teach readers that they are programmed organisms living inside consensual hallucinations, and to invite them to wake up. The opening chapter thus serves as an invitation and a warning. If you take this book seriously, you will begin to see through your programming, and that process can be both liberating and terrifying. One of the most powerful aspects of this chapter is Wilson's insistence that nobody is exempt from this condition. Even the most rational thinker, the most skeptical scientist, or the most disciplined philosopher is still subject to the thinker-prover dynamic. Their belief in rationality itself becomes the premise that the prover tirelessly confirms. Wilson demonstrates this with a playful and irreverent tone. He's not attacking rationality per se, but inviting us to realize that rationality itself can become a tunnel. Just as the devout religious believer filters all experience through a lens of divine will, so too can the scientist filter everything through the paradigm of materialism, dismissing phenomena that do not fit the framework. It is this reflexive quality of human consciousness that Wilson finds so fascinating and dangerous. Reflexive consciousness, our ability to think about our thoughts, is supposed to be what elevates humans above other animals. But Wilson argues that without metacognition, the ability to think critically about our belief systems themselves, this reflexivity simply tightens the noose around our necks, locking us ever more deeply into our self-confirming tunnels. The chapter is littered with examples that illustrate how profound and pervasive this mechanism is. For instance, Wilson describes how a paranoid person finds conspiracies everywhere, shadows on the wall, sideways glances. Coincidental events all become part of the conspiracy narrative because the prover is working overtime to confirm the paranoid thinker's thesis. And the same applies for optimistic people, who perceive meaning and positive signs everywhere. Their prover works just as tirelessly to confirm the thinker's orientation toward luck and abundance. This dynamic leads to one of Wilson's most important insights. Belief creates experience. What you believe at the core of your psyche shapes the reality you live in, not just psychologically, but perceptually. Your senses themselves become filtered by the operating system of your belief structures. Wilson challenges readers to look at their own lives and ask, what thinker-prover loops am I caught in? What evidence am I ignoring because it does not fit my tunnel? What experiences am I amplifying because they confirm my pre-existing beliefs? These are not rhetorical questions. They are invitations to engage in serious self-examination, to begin the work of dismantling the tunnel walls. The exercises Wilson proposes are deceptively simple, yet deeply subversive. He suggests, for example, that readers deliberately adopt belief systems they would normally reject, just to experience how rapidly the prover begins to generate confirming evidence. If you normally see the world as unfriendly and hostile, he'd suggest you spend a week deliberately believing that everyone is conspiring to help you, and watch as your prover begins to collect evidence of this new belief. Conversely, if you normally see yourself as lucky and blessed, deliberately adopt the belief that you are cursed and observe how quickly your prover rushes to confirm it. These exercises are designed not to convince readers of any particular belief system, but to demonstrate the plasticity and programmability of belief itself. By experimenting with beliefs in this way, readers begin to realize that their reality tunnel is not an objective fact but a contingent construction subject to alteration at will. Wilson's tone throughout this chapter is playful, yet deadly serious. He jokes, teases, provokes, and sometimes seems to mock the reader, but all in the service of shaking loose the rigid assumptions that bind us. His ultimate point is that our experience of the world is not determined by external reality, but by the software running in our brains, and that software can be rewritten. The chapter concludes with a profound challenge. If we are programmable creatures living inside subjective tunnels, then the project of self-liberation begins with the recognition that we can and must take responsibility for our programming. To fail to do so is to remain a prisoner of unconscious patterns. To accept the challenge is to embark on the Promethean task of self-creation. In Chapter 2 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson takes a decisive turn from philosophical provocation to an almost clinical dismantling of the very concept of the human being. He presents a striking metaphor that reframes everything about our self-conception. The human as a biocomputer, complete with hardware and software. This is not just a metaphor meant to shock. It's a rigorous model that Wilson deploys to explain precisely how our thoughts, emotions, reactions, and personalities arise, not from a pure self, but from systems shaped by evolutionary biology and conditioned programming. When he talks about hardware, he refers to our neuroanatomy, the nervous system that evolved through millions of years, hardwired for survival, instinct, and response to stimuli. The software represents the belief systems, values, biases, traumas, and conditioning that have been imprinted upon us through culture, family, education, religion, and personal experiences. From this perspective, you are not who you think you are. You are what has been programmed into your biocomputer's circuits. Wilson emphasizes that most of this programming occurs without our consent. Before you could think for yourself, you absorbed commands from your parents, teachers, media, and society. These early inputs form the basis of your operating system and run automatically. dictating your reactions, preferences, fears, and even your sense of self. But Wilson goes further than simply explaining this condition. He argues that because we are programmable, we are reprogrammable. The implication is profound. If your mind operates as a biocomputer, you can, through practice, experimentation, and awareness, install new software, override outdated routines, and update the system. This idea is radical because it undermines the cherished illusion of personal identity as something stable, continuous, and authentic. What we call I is in fact a collection of conditioned responses embedded in our neural hardware. Wilson suggests that most people never realize this. They mistake their programming for their essence. To them, the thought, "I am this kind of person," feels like a description when in fact it's a program running in the machine. To illustrate this idea, Wilson offers examples of how behaviors and values that feel innate are often simply absorbed from early environmental conditioning. A child raised in a Catholic household will tend to accept Catholic beliefs and taboos. A child raised in an Islamic context will absorb Islamic frameworks. A child raised by atheists will absorb skepticism. But Wilson is not merely pointing to religion. Every dimension of our identity, from political preferences to taste in art, food, and relationships, stems from the initial programs we downloaded. It's here that Wilson's brilliance shines. He refuses to let this model lapse into deterministic despair. Instead, he frames it as an invitation to freedom. If you understand that your prejudices, likes, dislikes, and even your neuroses are software programs, you can start to work on them deliberately. Awareness is the first step to liberation. Wilson builds upon Timothy Leary's 8-circuit model of consciousness here. The first 4 circuits are biosurvival, emotional territorial, symbolic, verbal, and social sexual. They are programmed early and form the core operating system of the human mind. Higher circuits, related to metaprogramming, mystical experience, neurogenetic awareness, and quantum consciousness, are largely dormant in most individuals unless activated through intentional practices. In this sense, Wilson posits a hierarchy of software sophistication. The average human operates mostly in the first 4 circuits, managing survival, emotions, language, and social sexual roles. But the higher circuits offer evolutionary potential, a glimpse into a post-human consciousness where individuals can reprogram themselves beyond the rigid structures of cultural conditioning. And yet, Wilson never promises that this evolutionary potential is easy to access. In fact, the very nature of the biocomputer ensures that most people will defend their existing programming fiercely, interpreting any challenge to their belief structures as an attack on their very identity. This, Wilson suggests, is why political arguments are so often futile, why religious debates produce so much heat but so little light, and why individuals cling to self-destructive patterns even when intellectually aware that they cause suffering. Wilson describes how the thinker-prover dynamic, introduced in Chapter 1, operates within this biocomputer framework. The thinker accepts inputs, beliefs, and paradigms. The prover scours experience to confirm them. The feedback loop is automatic and self-reinforcing. The more one believes a thing, the more the prover gathers confirming evidence, tightening the programming. For Wilson, this model leads directly to an existential question: who or what is doing the programming? Is there an I at the core of the biocomputer who can rise above the conditioning and deliberately rewrite the code? Or is that too an illusion, a recursive feedback loop where the idea of a self-programmer is itself a program? Rather than resolve this paradox philosophically, Wilson invites readers to test the hypothesis experientially. This is not armchair speculation, it's an operational directive. He challenges us to experiment with belief systems deliberately, adopting new paradigms temporarily just to observe how quickly the prover finds confirming evidence. If you are normally politically conservative, spend a month viewing the world through progressive lenses. If you are progressive, adopt a conservative worldview for a while. If you are skeptical about mystical experiences, spend time immersing yourself in them. The goal is not to convert you to any particular system, but to prove to yourself how plastic and programmable your perceptions truly are. At this point in the chapter, Wilson's tone becomes almost giddy. a mixture of joy and danger. This isn't just an exercise in intellectual curiosity, it's an experiment in self-transcendence. To genuinely grasp that your mind is programmable is to take the first step toward conscious evolution. It is also the first step toward realizing that your very self, the narrative you call I, is malleable, fluid, contingent. Wilson shares anecdotes from psychological research and his own experiments that illustrate this plasticity. He describes how hypnotic suggestions can override even deep-seated fears and phobias, or how placebo effects demonstrate the mind's capacity to heal the body based on belief alone. These examples are meant to reinforce the central point. The line between reality and belief is not clear-cut. Belief actively constructs reality itself. From here, Wilson expands the metaphor further. If individuals are programmable, so are societies. Culture itself is the collective programming of minds on a mass scale. Mass media, education systems, religious institutions, and political propaganda all serve as programming channels, imprinting desired patterns onto populations. The obedient citizen, the loyal consumer, the patriotic soldier, all are products of social software. In this sense, Wilson's biocomputer model is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it reveals the possibility of freedom through reprogramming, and terrifying because it exposes how thoroughly conditioned we are, how deeply the programs run. Throughout this chapter, Wilson continually returns to one of his key themes: meta-programming, the ability to recognize and modify your own programs. The fifth circuit in Leary's model, the neurosomatic circuit, represents this meta-awareness. Activation of this circuit allows individuals to become aware of the programming itself and to begin rewriting it consciously. The exercises Wilson proposes are deceptively simple but deeply radical. One such exercise involves writing down all your core beliefs about yourself, your identity, your values, your worldview, and then systematically questioning each one. Where did this come from? Who programmed me to believe this? Do I have any independent reason for accepting this belief? How would my experience of reality change if I adopted an opposing belief? By practicing such exercises, the reader begins to experience firsthand the fluidity of identity and perception. What seemed fixed begins to dissolve. The personality itself becomes a laboratory for experimentation. Wilson is careful to remind the reader that this path is not for everyone. Many will find the realization that they are programmable deeply unsettling, even intolerable. For some, it will provoke defensive reactions, anger, denial, or even despair. But for those willing to go through this process, Wilson promises a kind of rebirth, the emergence of a self-aware programmer who can choose their own operating system deliberately rather than unconsciously repeating inherited patterns. As the chapter closes, Wilson's tone shifts from playful to almost prophetic. He warns that the future of humanity depends on our collective ability to recognize and transcend our programming. Unless we learn to reprogram ourselves individually and culturally, we will remain trapped in the same destructive loops that have plagued human history: tribalism, war, prejudice, dogma, and repression. The chapter ends not with easy answers, but with an open-ended challenge. The task of self-reprogramming is lifelong, difficult, and requires courage, but the alternative is stagnation, living as an automaton inside someone else's script. In Chapter 3 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson invites us into the deepest foundations of human consciousness, the most ancient part of our psychic architecture, the first circuit, the oral biosurvival circuit. This is the primal level of awareness that develops immediately upon birth, or even before, and governs our most basic instinct, survival itself. Wilson's framing of the human mind as an 8-circuit biocomputer begins here, in the earliest imprint a creature receives, which becomes the cornerstone of all future behavior and perception. The oral biosurvival circuit is named for the newborn's first mode of interacting with the world, the mouth. In the infant's first moments, it seeks nourishment, protection, and comfort from the mother. The infant's earliest experience of existence is mediated through this act of suckling, swallowing, and bonding, a relationship that defines the infant's perception of whether the world is safe or hostile. What Wilson makes clear is that this circuit is not metaphorical. It is neurological and biological, embedded in the very structure of the developing brain. If the first imprint is secure and nurturing, the infant develops a default sense that the world is a friendly place. If the imprint is traumatic, neglectful, or abusive, the infant develops a worldview based on anxiety, threat, and distrust. This foundational yes-no to existence, a fundamental binary code, is laid down before language, before reason, before any self-awareness. It becomes the deep root of personality. According to Wilson, the imprint of the oral biosurvival circuit will dictate everything from one's posture and bodily tension to one's future ability to form trusting relationships. Wilson draws on comparative ethology to illustrate this point. He reminds us that imprinting is a universal mammalian phenomenon. The classic example is Lawrence's work with ducklings, who would imprint on any moving object present at a critical period shortly after hatching, whether that object was their biological mother, a human, or even a toy train. The same principle applies to human infants. Whatever pattern of safety or danger is present during early infancy becomes the lens through which all future experiences of security and threat are filtered. Here is where Wilson's analysis becomes especially potent. This first circuit governs not only infant behavior, but adult reactions to fear, risk, and the unknown. In a sense, every adult retains an infantile core, a biosurvival imprint that operates unconsciously, triggering either trust or fear in new situations, environments, and relationships. Whether we recoil from strangers, leap into adventure, shrink from danger, or embrace challenge, we are often reenacting the foundational imprint of the oral biosurvival circuit. Wilson provides an incisive commentary on how this circuit shapes society at large. He describes how national cultures themselves seem to operate according to their dominant biosurvival imprints. A nation that experienced early insecurity, whether through war, colonization, or trauma, may collectively adopt suspicious, defensive, and fear-based postures, building walls both literal and psychological. Conversely, a culture founded on trust and abundance may exhibit openness, hospitality, and a willingness to explore. The chapter also critiques the way modern society often manipulates this circuit deliberately through advertising, propaganda, and political rhetoric. Wilson notes that fear is one of the most potent tools of manipulation because it bypasses rational thought and goes straight to the primal survival mechanism. Politicians who cultivate fear of the other are activating the population's biosurvival circuit, triggering anxiety and prompting obedience. Likewise, marketers who promise safety, comfort, or security appeal directly to this ancient circuit. But Wilson is not simply diagnosing a problem. He offers an avenue toward freedom. He proposes that by understanding this circuit's operation, we can begin to loosen its grip and recognize when our biosurvival anxieties are being manipulated. He also extends this analysis into personal psychology. Phobias, for example, are classic manifestations of a malfunctioning biosurvival circuit. The fear of spiders, snakes, heights, enclosed spaces, all stem from exaggerated survival responses that may have once served a purpose but have now become maladaptive. Wilson draws a brilliant connection between the biosurvival circuit and neurochemistry, describing how substances like alcohol, opiates, and other depressants interact with this circuit. These substances create artificial feelings of security, dampening biosurvival anxiety temporarily, but often leading to addiction precisely because they simulate the original imprint of maternal security and comfort. Wilson emphasizes that a well-adjusted biosurvival circuit is flexible, capable of recalibrating itself in response to changing circumstances. In contrast, a rigid biosurvival imprint leads to chronic anxiety, rigidity, and fearfulness, a perpetual no to life. It is this distinction between flexibility and rigidity that becomes a key diagnostic for psychological health throughout the book. He also invites us to consider how this circuit's influence extends into adult relationships, especially intimate ones. Many adults unconsciously project their biosurvival needs onto romantic partners, seeking in them a surrogate mother who can guarantee safety and security. This dynamic, Wilson suggests, can lead to codependency and unrealistic expectations in relationships, a pattern recognizable to many readers. Wilson's writing here is playful but incisive. He challenges the reader to recognize their own biosurvival programming in everyday behavior. For example, do you seek comfort food when stressed? Do you crave physical affection during times of anxiety? Do you avoid certain situations because they trigger deep-rooted feelings of danger? All these behaviors, Wilson argues, can be traced back to the first imprint. The key, as always, is metaprogramming, the ability to observe one's own reactions and recognize them as programs rather than immutable truths. Wilson's advice is simple, yet revolutionary. Whenever you find yourself overwhelmed by fear, ask whether this fear is truly relevant to the current situation or whether it is a replay of early programming. By practicing this kind of observation, the reader begins to loosen the grip of unconscious imprints and gains the capacity to respond more flexibly. Toward the end of the chapter, Wilson offers exercises designed to activate this self-awareness. One such exercise involves deliberately placing oneself in mildly uncomfortable situations and observing the biosurvival responses that arise. For example, sitting in a new part of town, striking up a conversation with a stranger, or even altering one's diet, these small experiments reveal how quickly the biosurvival circuit reacts to novelty with either trust or suspicion. Another exercise involves deliberately cultivating sensations of physical safety and comfort in situations that would normally provoke anxiety. Through breath work, posture adjustment, and body awareness, the reader can simulate the sense of maternal security that the biosurvival circuit craves, thereby gradually rewiring the response patterns. Wilson's style here is both compassionate and challenging. He reminds readers that this is not about eliminating fear entirely, a biologically impossible and unwise goal, but about calibrating fear appropriately to the actual risks of the moment. As Wilson closes the chapter, he hints at a profound principle that will echo throughout the book. The biosurvival imprint sets the tone for all subsequent circuits. If the foundational imprint is rigid, fearful, or traumatized, it will distort the development of higher circuits, limiting creativity, social flexibility, intellectual openness, and even mystical awareness. Conversely, a flexible, secure biosurvival imprint provides a stable platform for further growth and exploration. The promise of this chapter is extraordinary. By reprogramming the biosurvival circuit, we can begin the work of liberating ourselves from deep-seated anxieties and open ourselves to a more expansive, joyful, and adventurous engagement with life. The oral biosurvival circuit is not merely a relic of infancy. It is a living, active dimension of consciousness that continues to shape every moment of our adult experience. To understand it, observe it, and reprogram it consciously is to take the first real step toward becoming the kind of self-aware, evolutionary being Wilson envisions. In Chapter 4 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson guides us into the second layer of consciousness in his 8-circuit model, the anal territorial circuit, sometimes called the emotional territorial circuit. If the first circuit, the oral biosurvival circuit, concerns basic trust and physical survival, the second circuit introduces a crucial new dimension: dominance, submission, power, and territoriality. Here, Wilson deftly traces the roots of hierarchical behavior, showing that far from being a sophisticated cultural construct, it is biologically hardwired into mammalian brains. From the moment an organism establishes its safety, it begins negotiating its position in a social hierarchy. We see this behavior in dogs, wolves, primates, and, as Wilson emphasizes, in humans too. This second circuit is where the individual transitions from simply surviving to competing for space, status, and control over resources. At its core, this circuit programs what Wilson calls the dominance hierarchy, a biologically driven pecking order where each individual must learn its rank. Whether one acts as a dominant alpha, a submissive beta, or an outsider, altogether depends heavily on early imprinting. In this sense, Wilson suggests that our entire relationship to authority and power is shaped by early emotional conditioning. The way we respond to parents, teachers, bosses, police, politicians, and even to abstract institutions reflects deeply ingrained patterns formed in childhood. Wilson's framing is profound because it forces the reader to confront the fact that what we often think of as rational responses to power are actually emotional reflexes inherited from our primate ancestors. When someone lashes out at perceived disrespect, freezes before an authoritarian figure, or unconsciously seeks approval from those with status, they are acting from this ancient territorial software. These reactions are not reflective judgments, but instinctual behaviors aimed at preserving one's place in the social hierarchy. In typical Wilsonian style, he mixes neuroscience, anthropology, and humor. He compares human workplaces to monkey troops, pointing out that office politics, corporate hierarchies, and bureaucratic structures all reflect the anal territorial circuit in action. The modern boardroom is merely an elaborate extension of the primate jungle, with power plays, submission signals, and the policing of territory dressed in the language of professionalism and decorum. One of the key insights Wilson provides is that early imprinting on this circuit can result in either authoritarian or rebellious personalities. A child who learns early that submission leads to safety may grow into an adult who instinctively defers to authority and seeks security through obedience. Conversely, a child who experiences authoritarian figures as hostile may develop a chronic rebelliousness. Challenging authority reflexively even when doing so is self-defeating. This binary imprinting, submission or dominance, explains why people often react emotionally rather than rationally to symbols of authority. The police uniform, the corporate title, the teacher's posture, these are territorial markers that activate deeply encoded responses in the Second Circuit. But Wilson takes this further by emphasizing that territoriality extends beyond mere physical space. It encompasses conceptual and symbolic spaces too. Nations stake claims on geographical territories, but also on ideological territories such as morality, history, and culture. This explains why people defend their turf so passionately, even when it is purely symbolic: ideas, opinions, values. The Second Circuit treats these as if they were physical property. Wilson illustrates this with striking examples from history and politics. Wars, revolutions, and social conflicts are often Second Circuit struggles, regardless of the ideological language used to justify them. Borders, flags, national anthems, all appeal to this ancient emotional circuitry, eliciting loyalty, fear, aggression, and pride. In everyday life, Wilson points out that even our body language reflects this circuit's influence. Posture, facial expressions, tone of voice, all serve as signals of dominance or submission. The puffed chest, the assertive gaze, the firm handshake, these are contemporary expressions of ancient primate behaviors designed to establish hierarchy and maintain one's status. Wilson's tone remains playful but cutting as he skewers the absurdity of adult humans enacting dominance rituals inherited from our primate ancestors. He invites the reader to observe these behaviors in daily life, to watch how people navigate cues, vie for attention in conversations, assert their opinions in meetings. Once seen through the lens of the anal territorial circuit, much of human social life appears as an elaborate dance of power and submission. But Wilson is not merely pointing out the obvious. His deeper purpose is to invite self-awareness and freedom. Just as with the First Circuit, he believes that recognizing the Second Circuit's influence is the first step toward liberation. If we can observe our automatic dominant submission reflexes, we can choose to act differently, not from programming, but from conscious intention. Wilson also explores the neurochemical correlates of this circuit, explaining how hormones like testosterone, adrenaline, and cortisol regulate dominance behaviors. He notes that stimulants, like caffeine and amphetamines, tend to activate Second Circuit assertiveness, while depressants dampen it. This biochemical lens reinforces his central claim: our personalities are not fixed essences, but dynamic systems shaped by both early imprinting and ongoing chemical states. One particularly fascinating aspect of this chapter is Wilson's discussion of symbolic territory. He argues that the Second Circuit is responsible for much of what we call morality, especially moral outrage. When someone feels that their moral territory has been invaded, they react with aggression and defensiveness just as they would if their physical territory were threatened. This explains why discussions of politics, religion, and ethics often become heated and intractable. Wilson wryly observes that debates about abortion, sexuality, or freedom of speech are rarely about abstract principles alone. They are territorial battles waged with words. The combatants may believe they are defending truth or justice, but their nervous systems are responding as if they are defending turf. The chapter reaches its most subversive point when Wilson proposes that modern society has institutionalized the dominance hierarchy through legal, political, and corporate systems, ensuring that most individuals internalize their place in the pecking order and police themselves. In this sense, oppression is not merely external, it is internalized, embodied, and self-enforced. People learn to stay in their place long before anyone explicitly tells them to do so. Yet, consistent with Wilson's larger project, this analysis is not deterministic. He argues that the very plasticity of the nervous system makes it possible to reprogram these reflexes. Through self-observation, experimentation, and intentional practice, individuals can loosen the grip of second circuit conditioning, refusing to react reflexively to dominant signals and cultivating new ways of relating. The exercises Wilson proposes for this circuit reflect his playful but rigorous method. One involves deliberately altering one's posture, tone of voice, and facial expressions to experiment with different dominant-submission signals and observe how others respond. For example, walking through a crowded space with exaggerated confidence and observing changes in social dynamics, then repeating the exercise with deliberately submissive body language. Another exercise involves identifying one's emotional triggers related to authority and hierarchy. When do you feel threatened, submissive, aggressive, or defensive? Where did those responses originate? Are they appropriate to the current context, or are they relics of early imprinting? Wilson also encourages readers to experiment with breaking social scripts gently, standing slightly too close to someone, using unexpected body language or altering conversational rhythms, to explore how fragile and programmable social dominance cues really are. His larger point is that most people live their entire lives constrained by invisible dominance hierarchies, never realizing that these structures are not immutable laws of nature but conditional reflexes that can be examined, challenged, and transcended. By the end of the chapter, Wilson makes clear that freedom begins with self-awareness. The individual who can recognize and regulate their second circuit programming becomes capable of stepping outside the automatic scripts of dominance and submission, responding creatively and flexibly to life's challenges. But Wilson also warns that most people will resist this freedom. The comfort of knowing one's place, even if it is a subordinate one, often outweighs the anxiety of questioning hierarchy altogether. This is why revolutions so often fail or result in new forms of authoritarianism. The human nervous system is deeply habituated to dominant structures, and without conscious reprogramming, the oppressed often recreate the same patterns they sought to escape. In this sense, Chapter 4 is not merely a psychological analysis, it is a political manifesto disguised as neuroscience. Wilson is offering readers a map of the forces that govern their lives and inviting them to seize the Promethean fire of self-programming to transcend these forces consciously. In Chapter 5 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson brings together the two foundational circuits he has introduced so far, the oral biosurvival circuit and the anal territorial circuit, and demonstrates how they engage in a perpetual dialectic, an ongoing tension that governs much of human behavior. This chapter marks a significant moment in the book because here, Wilson synthesizes biology, psychology, and culture into a single model. The human animal caught between trust and fear, submission and dominance, love and aggression. The first circuit, as Wilson emphasized in Chapter 3, programs our relationship to basic security. Is the world a safe place or a dangerous one? The second circuit, as explored in Chapter 4, programs our relationship to status, power, and territory. Are we dominant or submissive, leaders or followers, secure in our turf or anxious about our position? Chapter 5 begins by exploring how these two circuits interact dynamically throughout our lives, forming the bedrock of human personality and behavior. A person with a positive biosurvival imprint, Circuit 1, but a negative territorial imprint, Circuit 2, might move through life feeling basically safe but constantly insecure about their social rank. Conversely, someone with a negative biosurvival imprint but a dominant second circuit imprint might navigate the world as a fearful authoritarian, seeking control over others as a compensation for deep-seated anxiety. This interplay between the circuits is not a philosophical abstraction. It manifests in every area of daily life: how we relate to authority, how we compete for jobs, how we fall in love, how we negotiate friendships and social hierarchies. For Wilson, this dialectic explains much of what we mistakenly call personality. The vast diversity of human personalities, in his view, are variations on these two basic axes: survival, comfort, versus anxiety and dominance versus submission. Wilson draws from a broad array of disciplines to make this point, weaving together ethology, the study of animal behavior, psychology, and sociology. He notes that in primate troops, these two circuits govern virtually all interactions. The infant monkey clings to its mother for biosurvival reassurance, first circuit, while observing and eventually navigating the dominance hierarchy, second circuit. In humans, these two circuits form the infrastructure for all later cognitive development. What makes this chapter so compelling is Wilson's insistence that modern humans are still governed by these ancient programs, often without realizing it. The adult who feels threatened when their territory is challenged, whether that territory is a physical space, a political ideology, or a personal opinion, is not operating from rational thought, but from the deep wiring of these first two circuits. Wilson invites readers to see this clearly in their own lives. Every time you argue to win a debate, every time you feel slighted by a perceived insult, every time you assert control over your environment, you are reenacting the dialectic of circuits 1 and 2. Even love and romance, which we like to imagine as ethereal and spiritual, often arise from these circuits. The lover who seeks a nurturing partner is responding to biosurvival needs, while the competition for mates reflects second circuit dominance behavior. A profound insight Wilson offers is that the first circuit determines whether the second circuit operates from confidence or insecurity. If the biosurvival imprint is positive, the individual is likely to feel secure enough to be flexible and adaptive in social hierarchies. If the biosurvival imprint is negative, the individual may become rigid, paranoid, and authoritarian in their territorial responses. This explains why some people seem naturally comfortable in their own skin, while others are chronically defensive or aggressive. Wilson's analysis extends beyond the individual to the societal level. He proposes that entire cultures can be understood as collective expressions of these circuits. A society that fosters basic security through adequate food, shelter, healthcare, will tend to produce individuals whose second circuit behavior is flexible and cooperative. In contrast, a society marked by scarcity, inequality, or fear will generate rigid, hierarchical, authoritarian structures, an expression of widespread biosurvival anxiety. Wilson's playful but sharp critique of modern civilization emerges here. Much of what we think of as politics is simply second circuit posturing by individuals and institutions whose first circuit needs are unmet or whose programming has instilled insecurity. Nations parade their military might, leaders puff up their rhetorical chests, corporations guard their market share like primates defending territory. Underneath the rhetoric of national interest, moral values, or economic policy, Wilson sees the same primate game playing out: a biosurvival animal managing anxiety through territorial control. One of the most subversive ideas in this chapter is that even intellectual and philosophical systems are shaped by these circuits. For example, Wilson argues that authoritarian ideologies tend to emerge from individuals and societies dominated by negative biosurvival and territorial imprinting, systems of thought designed to control and regiment behavior to compensate for deep-seated insecurity. Conversely, libertarian or anarchistic philosophies emerge more easily from individuals whose imprinting has produced security and confidence. But Wilson is careful to avoid oversimplification. He acknowledges that the dialectic between the first two circuits is not static. It evolves throughout life, influenced by experience, trauma, healing, and conscious work. The individual can, through effort and awareness, modify their responses, becoming less reactive, more flexible, and ultimately more free. As always, Wilson's tone is playful, yet cutting. He mocks the pomposity of human culture, comparing it to territorial pissing contests between primates. Yet his mockery is tinged with compassion. He sees humans as evolutionary animals trapped in ancient circuits, suffering because they mistake their conditioned responses for rational choices. Wilson's project is not simply to diagnose, but to liberate. He proposes that once we understand this dialectic and how it programs our behavior, we can begin to disengage from it, stepping outside the automatic scripts of dominance and submission, fear and aggression. This is where the evolutionary potential of humans lies, in becoming conscious of the unconscious programs that drive us and choosing to rewrite them. His exercises at the end of this chapter are simple yet profound. One exercise involves observing one's reactions to authority figures and analyzing them in terms of biosurvival and territorial imprinting. When you feel deference, fear, anger, or rebellion in response to a figure of authority, ask yourself, is this response appropriate to the present situation, or is it an echo of early conditioning? Another exercise asks readers to consciously test their territorial reflexes by altering their behavior in small ways, sitting in a different seat, speaking up in a situation where they would normally stay silent, or allowing others to win trivial arguments to observe their own emotional reactions. These experiments are designed to reveal the automatic nature of our territorial responses and provide opportunities to loosen their grip. Wilson also proposes that healing the biosurvival imprint is a key to unlocking flexibility in the territorial circuit. Practices that generate physical comfort, relaxation, and trust, such as meditation, bodywork, or breath control, can help re-imprint the first circuit, creating a new baseline of safety from which second circuit behaviors can be adjusted. As he closes this chapter, Wilson hints at the vast territory still ahead in Prometheus Rising. The first two circuits, though primitive, form the foundation for all higher circuits: symbolic thought, social sexual behavior, aesthetic experience, mystical consciousness. But unless these foundational circuits are understood and reprogrammed where necessary, they will distort the development of all higher capacities. The reader is left with a profound sense of both humility and empowerment. Humility because Wilson has shown how much of what we imagine as our personality is simply the residue of ancient primate programs. Empowerment because he has also shown that these programs can be observed, understood, and changed through conscious effort. In the grand arc of Prometheus Rising, Chapter 5 serves as a pivot point. We have moved from describing individual circuits to understanding how they interact, how they form the matrix of human personality and society, and how they can be transcended. The dialectic of trust versus fear, dominance versus submission, openness versus defensiveness. This is the struggle at the heart of every human life. Wilson's message is both sobering and exhilarating. You are a programmed organism, but you can become your own programmer. The dialectic of the first two circuits explains much of your behavior, but you need not remain its prisoner. Through awareness, experimentation, and courage, you can begin to play a new game, not the primate game of rank and territory, but the Promethean game of conscious evolution. In Chapter 6 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson introduces us to a quantum leap in the evolutionary development of consciousness. The time-binding semantic circuit, which corresponds to Timothy Leary's third circuit in the eight-circuit model of consciousness. This circuit marks a profound transformation. While the first circuit governs survival and the second circuit governs territory and dominance, the third circuit allows the human animal to transcend immediate sensory experience and enter the realm of abstraction, symbol, and language. This is the circuit that enables us to bind time, to transmit knowledge across generations, to invent history, mathematics, law, and culture. Wilson starts by highlighting that this circuit is not simply the ability to speak. Instead, it is the human capacity to manipulate symbols, to encode reality into language, and then use that language to structure thought itself. In Wilson's characteristically provocative style, he suggests that it is not language that makes us human, it is language that makes us programmable animals. Whereas animals can learn behaviors through observation or imitation, humans create symbolic maps of reality. And these maps become the operating system of our minds. Language enables us to conceptualize the past, imagine the future, and form complex chains of reasoning. But this gift is also a curse. It is through language that dogma arises, that ideologies crystallize, and that human beings become trapped in linguistic prisons, mistaking words for realities. This is the circuit responsible for what Korzybski famously warned us about. The map is not the territory. Wilson invokes this principle throughout Chapter 6, underscoring how humans continually confuse symbols for the things they represent. Money is an abstraction representing value, but it becomes treated as value itself. Nations are conceptual constructs, but are treated as absolute realities. Words like good and evil are symbols for value judgments, but are often treated as objective truths. Wilson's exploration of this circuit takes on an almost meditative quality as he invites us to reflect on how thoroughly our perception of reality is shaped by semantic structures. Our internal dialogue, the endless chatter of thought, is linguistic. Our sense of self, our narratives about our identity, our beliefs about the world, all are encoded in language. He argues that the third circuit is where much of human suffering arises, precisely because it creates the illusion that the linguistic structures in our minds are equivalent to external reality. When we cling to ideological positions, identify with rigid belief systems, or become entranced by the language of advertising, we are allowing the time-binding semantic circuit to dominate our experience. But Wilson does not denounce this circuit as inherently problematic. Instead, he acknowledges its extraordinary power while emphasizing the importance of metaprogramming, the capacity to recognize when we are trapped in symbolic structures and to step back from them. Throughout Chapter 6, Wilson reminds us that this circuit's activation occurs during a particular developmental period in childhood, the time when the child begins to master language and the symbolic systems of their culture. The particular language and belief systems one acquires during this period imprint the structure of one's perception for life unless deliberately re-examined. In practical terms, this means that we do not just acquire words, we acquire worldviews. A child raised in a religious culture acquires not just language, but religious frames of interpretation. A child raised in a materialist culture acquires materialist frames. A child raised in a militaristic culture acquires hierarchical and combative frames. The semantic circuit installs the cultural operating system. Wilson's warning is stark. Most people never learn to distinguish between their culturally acquired semantic structures and reality itself. They live inside their culturally programmed maps and mistake them for the territory. This accounts for much of the division, prejudice, and misunderstanding that characterize human societies. To illustrate this point, Wilson introduces an incisive observation. While humans are capable of transmitting knowledge across generations, they are also capable of transmitting ignorance, bias, and error with equal ease. The semantic circuit allows us to encode not only science, philosophy, and art, but also bigotry, propaganda, and dogma. The same circuit that produces poetry also produces superstition. The same linguistic machinery that allows for rational discourse also allows for self-delusion. Wilson's playful skepticism shines through as he critiques human institutions built on this circuit. Universities, religious organizations, political parties, all are repositories of accumulated semantic structures. Some of these structures help us understand the world more clearly. Others obscure reality behind layers of abstraction and ideology. This leads to one of the most important insights in Chapter 6. Reality is mediated through symbols. Our entire experience of the world is filtered through semantic networks, and unless we cultivate awareness of this process, we live in a world of symbols rather than in the world itself. Wilson's antidote is metaprogramming, the deliberate practice of observing and questioning the semantic structures through which we interpret experience. He encourages readers to practice distinguishing between the thing itself and their linguistic representation of it. When we look at a tree, for instance, we do not see the raw phenomenon. We see a tree only because we have a semantic category for it. Our minds instantly interpret sensory input through the filter of language. Wilson invites us to imagine looking at reality without immediately labeling it, to practice a form of semantic detachment where we observe phenomena directly, before our minds rush to categorize and interpret. This practice, he suggests, can help us loosen the hold of semantic programming and experience a more immediate, vivid, and flexible relationship with reality. Another key insight in Chapter 6 is the plasticity of this circuit. While the first two circuits are more deeply tied to survival instincts and emotional reflexes, the third circuit is highly adaptable. Language is a tool that can be learned, unlearned, and relearned. This means that reprogramming the semantic circuit is both possible and necessary if we wish to escape the confines of rigid belief systems. Wilson emphasizes that every major breakthrough in human thought, whether scientific, philosophical, or spiritual, has involved a disruption of existing semantic structures. The revolutionary thinker is one who questions the prevailing maps, who dares to challenge linguistic conventions and propose new ways of speaking and thinking about reality. In this sense, Wilson sees the semantic circuit as a source of both our greatest bondage and our greatest freedom. The bondage arises when we allow linguistic structures to harden into dogma. The freedom arises when we use language playfully, flexibly, as a tool for exploration, rather than as a cage for consciousness. Wilson also points out that the development of symbolic abstraction allows us to navigate multiple time horizons simultaneously. Through language, we can remember the past, plan for the future, and imagine scenarios that do not yet exist. This time-binding capacity is unique to the human species and forms the basis for culture, history, science, and art. But with this gift comes a psychological cost. We are haunted by the past and anxious about the future. Our linguistic minds replay memories, regrets, and traumas. They worry about possibilities, dangers, and uncertainties. The same circuit that allows us to plan and imagine also traps us in rumination and fear. Wilson's exercises at the end of this chapter are designed to help readers recognize the operation of this circuit in their own lives. One exercise involves deliberately practicing semantic awareness, noticing every time you label something with a word or concept and pausing to ask whether the label reflects reality or simply a linguistic habit. Another exercise suggests playing with language itself, inventing new words, experimenting with poetry, or deliberately using language in unconventional ways to break habitual patterns of thought. The chapter closes with Wilson's characteristic blend of humor and profundity. He reminds us that the semantic circuit is both our greatest tool and our greatest trap. To master it requires learning to treat language playfully, flexibly, and provisionally, as a map, not as the territory itself. By the end of Chapter 6, the reader is left with a powerful realization. Your experience of reality is mediated through language, and your freedom depends on your ability to recognize, question, and play with the semantic structures that shape your thoughts. This is not merely an intellectual insight, but a call to action. The practice of semantic self-awareness is a discipline that can liberate us from rigid beliefs, dogmatic thinking, and the tendency to mistake abstractions for reality. Wilson's larger project becomes clearer here. Each circuit is an evolutionary stage in human consciousness, and each carries both potentials and traps. The third circuit allows for culture, science, and philosophy, but also for ideology, propaganda, and semantic rigidity. Mastery of this circuit requires cultivating an ongoing awareness of the distinction between symbols and realities, maps and territories, thoughts and things. Ultimately, Wilson invites readers to begin experimenting, not just intellectually but behaviorally. The time-binding semantic circuit is programmable, flexible, and dynamic. The tools of freedom are already in your mind. The words you speak, the concepts you use, the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what the world is. To master these tools is to take another step toward the Promethean goal of conscious evolution. In Chapter 7 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson ushers us into the fourth layer of the 8-circuit model, the socio-sexual circuit. This circuit builds upon the foundations laid by the 3 prior circuits: survival, territoriality, and symbolic abstraction. But here, consciousness undergoes another quantum leap. It begins to encode social roles, sexual identities, moral codes, and interpersonal bonding patterns. Wilson begins by emphasizing that this circuit emerges in early childhood but becomes most fully active during puberty, when sexual maturation triggers the flood of hormones that bind us biologically to the species' reproductive drive. But what makes this circuit particularly complex is that it does not deal merely with biological reproduction. It mediates the entire web of social behavior, from courtship rituals and marriage customs to gender roles, moral taboos, and cultural norms of civility. In his characteristic style, Wilson invites readers to examine how deeply this circuit is programmed by culture. whereas the biosurvival circuit is programmed largely by individual experiences of safety or danger, and the territorial circuit by emotional interactions with authority and hierarchy, the sociosexual circuit is heavily shaped by the collective norms of the society in which one is raised. It is here that Wilson makes one of his most subversive points. The human being is not born with a sexual identity, social role, or sense of morality. These are programmed constructs, culturally imposed onto the blank slate of this circuit during adolescence. In some cultures, certain sexual practices are celebrated, while in others they are condemned. Some cultures assign strict gender roles, while others allow for fluidity. Some cultures revere monogamy, others practice polygamy or promiscuity. These differences are not mere curiosities for Wilson. They are evidence that what we take for granted as normal or natural is, in fact, the product of cultural imprinting on the sociosexual circuit. This circuit is also responsible for a crucial aspect of human social behavior, the capacity for empathy, bonding, and loyalty to groups. Through this circuitry, we learn not just whom we may or may not have sex with, but also how to participate in family life, friendship networks, tribes, and larger social units. The sociosexual circuit is what allows humans to create civilizations. But Wilson's analysis reveals the shadow side of this programming. He points out that because this circuit is so malleable and culture-dependent, it can be easily programmed to enforce rigid, oppressive social norms. Moral codes, laws governing sexual behavior, ideas of decency and propriety, all become tools by which societies regulate behavior, often reinforcing dominance hierarchies established by Second Circuit imprinting. In this sense, the sociosexual circuit is both the source of human compassion and solidarity, and the means by which societies impose conformity and repress difference. Wilson illustrates this by describing how sexual guilt, shame, and repression are culturally programmed into individuals, creating neurotic patterns that distort not only sexuality, but social behavior as a whole. One of the most striking insights Wilson offers in this chapter is that what we call morality is largely an artifact of Fourth Circuit programming. Moral codes are socially constructed software designed to regulate sexual behavior, family structures, gender norms, and acceptable emotional expression. These codes vary wildly from culture to culture, but within any given society they appear natural and unquestionable until we see them for what they are: programs. Wilson invites the reader to recognize how thoroughly these codes shape their own lives. Every belief you hold about sex, romance, family, fidelity, modesty, politeness, and propriety reflects programming received from parents, teachers, religious authorities, peers, and media. These beliefs are so deeply ingrained that they often go unexamined. They operate as invisible assumptions about how things are supposed to be. As with the earlier circuits, Wilson emphasizes that this programming is not fixed. It can be changed. The individual can become aware of their sociosexual conditioning, examine it critically, and begin to reprogram their responses and beliefs. This is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a transformative process that opens the door to a freer, more authentic expression of sexuality and social bonding. Wilson also connects this circuit to the concept of ritual, explaining that rituals function as Fourth Circuit reprogramming tools. Coming-of-age ceremonies, weddings, funerals, religious rites, all serve to encode social roles and expectations into the individual's nervous system. Rituals create emotional intensity that etches the program into the circuitry, making it feel sacred and inviolable. But this also means that new rituals can serve as tools for reprogramming. Wilson suggests that countercultural movements, psychedelic experiences, and alternative lifestyles often create deconditioning rituals that liberate individuals from inherited sociosexual norms. This is why radical movements often experiment with communal living, polyamory, sexual freedom, and gender fluidity, not as mere hedonism, but as deliberate challenges to conventional programming. These experiments represent attempts to reprogram the Fourth Circuit consciously, expanding the range of human possibility beyond the narrow confines of traditional morality. At this point, Wilson takes a more playful tone, skewering both puritanical repression and libertine excess. He suggests that rigid sexual repression creates neurotic, guilt-ridden individuals whose fourth circuits are locked in a state of fear and shame, while mindless promiscuity can be just as mechanical, a reactionary attempt to rebel without genuine self-awareness. True freedom, Wilson argues, lies in recognizing the programmability of the sociosexual circuit and taking responsibility for one's own reprogramming. This means neither blind conformity to cultural norms nor blind rebellion against them, but the conscious choice to design a personal morality and social style based on self-knowledge and empathy. Wilson illustrates this with examples from anthropology. Societies like the Trobriand Islanders, where sexuality is celebrated without guilt, contrast sharply with Victorian England, where sexuality was shrouded in repression and taboo. The individual raised in one culture acquires an entirely different set of emotional responses to the same biological drives compared to the individual raised in the other. This leads to another key insight. Most human conflict over sex, gender, and morality is not about biology at all, but about Fourth Circuit programming differences. Culture wars are really programming wars, battles over which codes should govern the socio-sexual circuit. Wilson does not offer a simplistic solution to these conflicts. Instead, he invites readers to transcend them by recognizing their artificiality. The person who understands that morality is programmable can cease taking moral codes as absolutes and begin relating to them as historical cultural constructions. But this does not mean that Wilson advocates amoral relativism. On the contrary, he suggests that a consciously reprogrammed Fourth Circuit will tend toward compassion, flexibility, and mutual respect, precisely because it is no longer driven by guilt, shame, or rigid conformity. Wilson's exercises for this chapter are among his most provocative. One involves observing one's emotional reactions to sexual imagery, behaviors, or taboos, and tracing them back to their cultural origins. When you feel disgust, shame, arousal, or judgment, ask, "Where did I learn this response? Who programmed me to react this way?" Another exercise involves experimenting with alternative social behaviors, greeting strangers differently, breaking small norms of politeness or propriety, to observe one's own internal reactions and to loosen rigid programming. By the end of Chapter 7, the reader is left with a profound realization. Our sense of who we are socially and sexually is not innate. It is programmed, culturally specific, and subject to revision. To become conscious of this programming is to take a critical step towards self-liberation. Wilson's broader project becomes clearer still. The first four circuits form the basic operating system of the human mind: survival, territory, symbols, and society. Each circuit is shaped by early imprinting and cultural programming. Each can trap us in mechanical, conditioned responses, but each can also be examined, understood, and reprogrammed consciously. The socio-sexual circuit is where most of our emotional suffering lies: guilt, shame, alienation, fear of rejection. But it is also the circuit through which we can experience our greatest joys: intimacy, belonging, love, compassion. To master this circuit is to reclaim the freedom to design one's own morality and social existence, not as a reaction to conditioning, but as an expression of self-awareness. As Wilson closes the chapter, his message is clear. The Fourth Circuit is where we transition from animal to human, from instinctual to social, from biological to cultural. It is where we learn to participate in the grand game of civilization. But to play this game consciously rather than mechanically is to begin the Promethean task of self-evolution. In Chapter 8 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson introduces us to the neurosomatic circuit, also known as the Fifth Circuit in Timothy Leary's 8-circuit model of consciousness. This is a decisive turning point in Wilson's evolutionary framework, where the earlier circuits are primarily concerned with survival, territory, symbols, and social roles, deeply conditioned structures inherited from our evolutionary and cultural past. The Fifth Circuit represents the first major leap beyond conditioned reality. Here, consciousness begins to break free from rigid programs and enters the domain of direct sensation, embodied awareness, and hedonic self-regulation. Wilson emphasizes that this circuit's activation fundamentally alters the quality of experience. Instead of perceiving reality primarily through the linguistic and conceptual frameworks of the Third Circuit, or the moral and cultural filters of the fourth, the neurosomatic individual perceives reality somatically, through the body, directly, intimately. The world becomes vivid and fluid, shimmering with sensory richness. The body itself ceases to feel like an object that the mind inhabits, and instead is recognized as a dynamic energy field in constant interaction with its environment. This circuit is often activated during experiences that overwhelm the ordinary defenses of the ego, profound sexual ecstasy, psychedelic states, meditation, yoga, and spontaneous mystical awakenings. In these moments, Wilson says, the body-mind polarity dissolves. One no longer feels merely embodied, but becomes pure embodiment. The old Cartesian dualism, body versus mind, collapses, and the self emerges as a process, a living event rather than a fixed entity. Wilson sees this as not only a psychological event, but an evolutionary imperative. He argues that modern industrial society leaves most people locked into the first four circuits, repressing the bodily pleasures and freedoms of Fifth Circuit consciousness in favor of obedience, productivity, and survival anxiety. This repression manifests as chronic tension, alienation, and a disconnection from life's sensual immediacy. The rigid worker-consumer model of modern civilization, he suggests, thrives on the suppression of Fifth Circuit awareness. By keeping people locked in fear, guilt, and moral rigidity, societies ensure docile, obedient citizens who are easy to govern. The neurosomatic circuit, then, is not merely about feeling good or chasing pleasure. It represents an evolutionary gateway, a step toward greater self-regulation, adaptability, creativity, and freedom from the mechanical reactivity of earlier circuits. Individuals who successfully activate this circuit experience less fear, less defensiveness, and greater flexibility in responding to life's challenges. Wilson emphasizes that this circuit's consciousness is fundamentally nonverbal. Whereas the third circuit thinks in words and categories, and the fourth circuit thinks in moral codes and social scripts, the fifth circuit thinks through sensation and movement. Its language is that of rhythm, breath, posture, muscle tone, energy flow. It is the circuit that understands intuitively what modern somatic therapies try to teach, that emotions, thoughts, and bodily states are intertwined in a feedback loop. This is why activation of the fifth circuit so often feels like liberation. It releases the body from chronic muscular contractions and emotional armoring, allowing energy to circulate freely. Wilson draws on the work of Wilhelm Reich, who argued that much of human neurosis is frozen in muscular rigidity, a physical manifestation of repressed emotions and traumas. The fifth circuit, in this sense, is the gateway to what Reich called orgastic potency, the capacity to surrender to pleasure, energy flow, and spontaneous self-expression. Wilson also links this circuit to a vast range of spiritual traditions: tantric yoga, Taoist alchemy, Sufi whirling, shamanic trance, Zen meditation. All these practices, he suggests, are methods of activating and refining Fifth Circuit consciousness, ways of reprogramming the nervous system to experience life more fully, fluidly, and ecstatically. But Wilson is careful to note that this circuit can be misused or misinterpreted. As with all circuits, imbalance is possible. The individual who becomes obsessed with pleasure, addicted to altered states, or disconnected from the practical demands of life may fall into what Wilson calls bliss junkie behavior, using Fifth Circuit activation to escape rather than to integrate and evolve. True mastery of the neurosomatic circuit involves harmonizing it with the earlier circuits. One must retain the biosurvival security of the first circuit, the emotional intelligence of the second, the linguistic skill of the third, and the social awareness of the fourth, while adding the bodily freedom and ecstatic awareness of the fifth. This integration is what Wilson calls hedonic engineering, the deliberate cultivation of pleasure, energy flow, and bodily awareness as part of an overall project of self-development and conscious evolution. Wilson sees hedonic engineering as a revolutionary act because it undermines the core strategies of authoritarian societies. Governments and corporations, he argues, rely on populations that are fearful, tense, repressed, and easily manipulated. By contrast, individuals who have activated their neurosomatic circuitry tend to be more relaxed, more autonomous, less fearful, less submissive, and less interested in mindless consumerism. They become difficult to govern, not because they are rebellious in the Second Circuit sense of defiance, but because they no longer react mechanically to fear, guilt, or social pressure. Wilson also discusses the neurochemical basis of Fifth Circuit states. He suggests that neurotransmitters such as endorphins, serotonin, and oxytocin mediate the pleasures of this circuit, creating feelings of well-being, contentment, and loving connection. Practices like meditation, yoga, deep breathing, dancing, and sexual intimacy all stimulate these neurochemicals, supporting the feedback loop between consciousness and bodily pleasure. Toward the end of the chapter, Wilson invites readers to undertake experiments designed to activate their own neurosomatic circuit. One exercise involves developing continuous somatic awareness, noticing breath, posture, muscle tension, balance, and rhythm throughout the day. Another involves exploring forms of creative movement, dance, martial arts, yoga, or any practice that reconnects awareness with the body's innate intelligence. A more advanced exercise suggests exploring altered states of consciousness through meditation, breathwork, or, where legal and appropriate, carefully supervised psychedelic experiences to discover firsthand the pleasures and insights of Fifth Circuit consciousness. These exercises are not intended as mere lifestyle enhancements. They are part of Wilson's larger project of conscious self-reprogramming. The neurosomatic circuit opens a portal to self-transcendence, but the work must be integrated into a grounded, ethical, and flexible personality structure. By the chapter's conclusion, Wilson returns to the Promethean theme that gives the book its title. The human species stands at an evolutionary crossroads. The Fifth Circuit is not just a personal opportunity, but a collective imperative. In a world dominated by fear, violence, repression, and alienation, the widespread activation of neurosomatic consciousness could represent a path to peace, creativity, and ecological harmony. Wilson's message is both visionary and practical. He acknowledges that most people live in chronic tension and disconnection, unaware of the possibility of neurosomatic awakening. But he insists that this transformation is available to anyone willing to engage in self-observation, experimentation, and conscious practice. By the end of Chapter 8, the reader is left with an inspiring vision of human potential, a life lived not as a mechanical repetition of conditioned programs, but as a fluid, embodied dance of awareness, pleasure, and creativity. The neurosomatic circuit offers liberation, not from the body, but into the body as a vehicle of conscious evolution. This marks a profound transition in Prometheus Rising. With the Fifth Circuit, Wilson signals the beginning of the higher circuits, those that transcend the historical, cultural, and mechanical constraints of ordinary human life. The next chapters will build upon this foundation, exploring metaprogramming, transpersonal consciousness, and ultimately, what it means to participate consciously in evolution itself. In Chapter 9 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson introduces one of the most profound and empowering concepts in his 8-circuit model, the metaprogramming circuit, also known as the Sixth Circuit. While the previous circuits deal with survival, power, language, social conditioning, and bodily bliss, the metaprogramming circuit represents something altogether different, the nervous system becoming conscious of itself as programmable. This chapter marks a true shift into higher consciousness, but not in a vague mystical sense. The metaprogramming circuit is pragmatic, psychological, and revolutionary. It is the mechanism by which we can step outside all our previous programs, biological instincts, emotional reactions, conditioned beliefs, and cultural norms, and begin to write our own scripts consciously. Wilson begins by making a crucial distinction. Most people's sense of self, their beliefs, values, habits, and identity, are not their own creations, but the result of early imprinting and conditioning. The first 4 circuits, as he's explained, lock individuals into mechanical behavior patterns shaped by early experience and reinforced by culture. Even those who achieve the ecstatic awareness of the Fifth Circuit often remain unconscious of the deeper programs running in the background. The metaprogramming circuit, then, is the level at which the nervous system becomes aware of itself as a programmable biocomputer. This circuit allows the individual to recognize that everything they think, believe, feel, and perceive is filtered through neurological and psychological programs, and that these programs can, in principle, be modified. This is where Wilson's work begins to border on what would today be called cognitive science, consciousness hacking, and even neuroplasticity. He describes the metaprogramming circuit as a feedback loop in which the mind observes and can alter its own operations. Instead of being trapped in inherited software, the metaprogramming individual can experiment, try out new belief systems, adopt different frames of reference, and consciously install new habits and perceptions. Wilson emphasizes that this circuit is not speculative or philosophical. It is operational and experiential. To activate the metaprogramming circuit is to enter a state of playfulness with reality itself. The individual realizes that belief systems are tools, not truths, that worldviews are provisional, not absolute, and that identity itself is fluid and malleable. This is one of Wilson's most liberating insights. What the thinker thinks, the prover proves, a theme introduced earlier in the book, finds its fullest application here. If we can become aware that our nervous system proves whatever our thinker believes, then we can begin to choose new beliefs consciously, testing and revising them like a scientist running experiments. But Wilson is quick to note that this is not easy. The force of imprinting and conditioning is strong, and most people feel enormous resistance when confronted with the suggestion that their most cherished beliefs and identities are programmed responses. To fully engage the metaprogramming circuit requires courage, curiosity, and the willingness to experiment with one's own mind. Wilson illustrates this with a thought experiment. Imagine deliberately adopting a belief system you don't normally hold, just to observe how quickly your nervous system begins to prove it by filtering experience to match it. This can range from political ideologies to philosophical positions, religious doctrines, or psychological theories. The point is not to convert, but to recognize that all belief systems operate this way. They are lenses through which experience is filtered and organized. The metaprogramming circuit allows us to adopt reversible consciousness, the ability to try on different perspectives temporarily without rigid attachment, and to shift between them fluidly. This is where Wilson's work converges with elements of Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and contemporary mindfulness. All these traditions encourage loosening the grip of fixed concepts and cultivating a playful, flexible relationship with thought itself. Wilson also emphasizes that the metaprogramming circuit brings with it an experience of freedom unlike anything known in the lower circuits. To become aware that you are a programmed organism is humbling, but to realize that you can reprogram yourself is exhilarating. The metaprogrammer ceases to be a victim of conditioning and becomes an artist of consciousness, crafting their own worldview and personality with increasing sophistication. Wilson connects this circuit to the work of Timothy Leary, who coined the term reality tunnels to describe how each individual's experience of reality is shaped by their internal programs. The metaprogrammer is one who can recognize their reality tunnel as a tunnel, not as reality itself, and can begin to explore other tunnels, other maps, and other lenses. But Wilson also acknowledges a profound paradox here. Even the metaprogrammer is working within a nervous system shaped by evolution and biology. There is no pure self outside of programming. There is only increasing awareness of the processes by which programming occurs and the ability to modify it consciously. In this sense, freedom is not absolute but relative, a matter of degrees of awareness and flexibility. Wilson's tone in this chapter is both playful and serious. He celebrates the metaprogrammer as the modern Prometheus, stealing fire from the gods of biology, culture, and tradition to forge a new kind of human freedom. But he also warns that this freedom can be destabilizing. To recognize the arbitrariness of all belief systems can induce vertigo, doubt, and even nihilism. Yet for Wilson, this existential dizziness is the gateway to creative evolution. By relinquishing rigid belief structures, the metaprogrammer opens up to a pluralistic, experimental, and joyful approach to life. Reality becomes a playground, not a prison. The exercises Wilson proposes for this circuit reflect this spirit of experimentation. One exercise involves writing a list of your most strongly held beliefs about yourself and the world, and then systematically challenging each one. Where did this belief come from? Who programmed me to believe this? What evidence do I have? what alternative beliefs might also be valid. Another exercise encourages deliberately adopting new belief systems temporarily, embracing an unfamiliar philosophy, ideology, or worldview for a week or a month, to observe how quickly your nervous system begins to generate confirming evidence. This experiment reveals the plasticity of perception and the power of belief to shape experience. Wilson also suggests practicing semantic relativism, becoming aware of how language structures thought and exploring alternative ways of speaking and thinking. For example, replacing is statements with more tentative, flexible formulations. It seems to me that, or from this perspective, or according to this model. This linguistic practice helps loosen the rigid structures of Third Circuit abstraction and supports the flexible consciousness of the Sixth Circuit. One of the most profound aspects of this chapter is Wilson's assertion that the metaprogramming circuit is the key to personal evolution in the 21st century. He argues that humanity as a whole is approaching a crisis point. Old belief systems, religious dogmas, nationalistic ideologies, and cultural traditions are colliding in increasingly destructive ways, while new technologies and information flows are accelerating change. In this context, the individual who can think flexibly, adapt rapidly, and choose their beliefs consciously will thrive, while those trapped in rigid programs will suffer. The metaprogramming circuit, then, is not a luxury or a philosophical curiosity. It is a survival skill for the modern world. The ability to navigate multiple realities, to shift paradigms fluidly, to adopt new models provisionally, and discard them when they no longer serve. This is the hallmark of the postmodern Prometheus. By the end of Chapter 9, Wilson makes it clear that the metaprogramming circuit is both a tool and a challenge. It invites the reader to move beyond the comfort of certainty, to embrace ambiguity, complexity, and paradox, and to begin crafting a life as a conscious experiment in freedom. In the context of Prometheus Rising, this chapter represents a turning point. With the activation of the Sixth Circuit, the individual becomes capable of genuine self-direction. No longer a victim of inherited programs, no longer a prisoner of mechanical reactivity, the metaprogrammer begins to write their own code, design their own reality tunnels, and shape their own destiny. Wilson's message is exhilarating. You are a programmed biocomputer, but you can learn to program yourself. You are a conditioned organism, but you can choose your conditioning. You are a product of evolution, but you can participate in your own evolution consciously. This is the essence of the Promethean project, to steal fire from the gods of biology, culture, and tradition, and use it to ignite the evolutionary potential of human consciousness. In Chapter 10 of Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson takes us deeper into his model of human consciousness, introducing the Seventh Circuit, the neurogenetic circuit. If the Sixth Circuit, the metaprogramming circuit, gave us the ability to step back from our programs and reprogram ourselves consciously, the Seventh Circuit moves into an even more profound domain: genetic memory, species memory, and the collective unconscious. This circuit, Wilson suggests, gives individuals access to ancestral knowledge, not in the crude sense of remembering literal historical events, but in a biological, evolutionary sense. The neurogenetic circuit awakens a form of consciousness that recognizes itself as the product of millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. Here, the individual mind begins to dissolve into a larger continuity, not simply my mind, but the mind of life itself. Wilson is careful to frame this not as mystical poetry, but as a neurological reality. The genes we carry contain a record of survival strategies, adaptations, instincts, and tendencies refined across billions of generations. In this sense, the nervous system itself is a living history of evolution. The activation of the neurogenetic circuit brings this to awareness. One of Wilson's most striking insights is that this circuit begins to dismantle the boundaries of individual identity altogether. Whereas the earlier circuits are concerned with personal survival, status, symbolic abstraction, social roles, bodily bliss, and self-reprogramming, the Seventh Circuit invites identification with the species itself, and beyond that, with the entire evolutionary process. This awakening often coincides with deep, mystical, or psychedelic experiences, moments when individuals feel themselves part of the larger flow of life, intimately connected not just with other humans, but with animals, plants, ecosystems, and even the cosmos itself. Wilson links this circuit to the experiences described by shamans, mystics, and visionaries across cultures, a profound sense of timelessness, unity, and evolutionary participation. Wilson describes this as a radical expansion of identity. The ego, once thought to be the core of selfhood, is revealed as a temporary structure, a necessary adaptation for navigating circuits 1 through 6, but not the final word on who or what we are. In Seventh Circuit consciousness, identity expands to include ancestors, descendants, humanity as a whole, and even the evolutionary web of life. This dissolution of individual boundaries has profound psychological consequences. Wilson suggests that Seventh Circuit activation brings with it a kind of evolutionary compassion, a recognition that all human beings are expressions of the same genetic journey, and that our divisions and conflicts are transient phenomena in the larger sweep of life's unfolding. In this sense, the neurogenetic circuit is inherently transpersonal. Where the metaprogramming circuit allows us to rewrite our personal codes, the Seventh Circuit invites us to transcend personality altogether and recognize ourselves as part of an immense, ancient, and ongoing experiment in consciousness. But Wilson also warns that this circuit, like all the others, is double-edged. Without integration, Seventh Circuit experiences can lead to a loss of grounding, dissociation, or a kind of evolutionary arrogance, mistaking the experience of species consciousness for personal enlightenment or superiority. The challenge, as always, is balance, integrating the vast impersonal awareness of the neurogenetic circuit with the practical demands of circuits 1 through 6. Throughout this chapter, Wilson connects the neurogenetic circuit to various traditions and thinkers. He draws parallels to Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, the transpersonal psychology of Stanislav Grof, the evolutionary mysticism of Teilhard de Chardin, and the psychedelic visions of Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley. In all these traditions, we find the same idea, that the mind is not confined to the individual skull, but participates in a larger matrix of life and evolution. Wilson makes this point vividly. The very structure of your brain, its neurons, synapses, and chemical pathways, reflects the evolutionary struggles, triumphs, and experiments of untold generations. Your emotions, instincts, and perceptions are not merely yours. They are the inheritance of ancestors who survived by feeling, sensing, and acting in ways that ensured their survival and reproduction. The activation of the Seventh Circuit brings this awareness out of abstraction and into direct experience. Suddenly, one does not merely know that they are part of an evolutionary continuum. They feel it in their bones, their breath, their heartbeat. The sense of separation between self and species dissolves. The individual becomes an expression of life itself, unfolding in real time. This has ethical implications as well. Wilson suggests that Seventh Circuit consciousness naturally leads to a reverence for life, a sense of responsibility for the future of the species, for the health of ecosystems, and for the continuity of evolution itself. The narrow, selfish concerns of the ego are eclipsed by a broader sense of participation in the evolutionary process. Wilson also connects this circuit to emerging sciences, genetics, evolutionary biology, ecology, and systems theory. All these disciplines, in their different ways, reflect the shift from viewing life as a collection of separate entities to seeing it as an interconnected web of processes and relationships. The neurogenetic circuit is the experiential counterpart to these scientific paradigms. It is what it feels like to live as part of this web, to recognize oneself as a temporary node in a vast evolutionary network. As always, Wilson provides practical exercises to help readers explore this circuit. One exercise involves meditating on one's ancestors, not just personal ancestors, but evolutionary ancestors, imagining the long line of organisms whose lives made yours possible, from primates to reptiles to fish to single-celled organisms to the first flickering forms of life in ancient oceans. Another exercise invites readers to contemplate the future of the species. What kind of ancestor are you becoming? What programs, values, and ideas are you transmitting to the next generation? How are your actions today shaping the evolutionary path of life on this planet? A particularly powerful exercise encourages readers to practice species identification, looking at all human beings, including those one dislikes or fears, as distant cousins, participants in the same evolutionary experiment. This exercise is designed to dissolve tribalism, prejudice, and the illusion of separation. Wilson's tone throughout this chapter is visionary but grounded. He acknowledges that Seventh Circuit experiences can seem abstract or esoteric, but he insists that they are deeply practical. The individual who recognizes themselves as part of an evolutionary continuum is less likely to act destructively, less prone to narrow-minded selfishness, and more capable of embracing change, uncertainty, and novelty. By the end of Chapter 10, Wilson makes it clear that the neurogenetic circuit is not merely a personal achievement, but an evolutionary threshold. It represents the beginning of what might be called planetary consciousness, the ability to think and feel not as an isolated ego, but as a participant in the larger dance of life. This is consistent with Wilson's larger Promethean project, to awaken individuals to their full evolutionary potential, to liberate them from mechanical programs, and to invite them into conscious participation in the unfolding drama of existence. At this point in Prometheus Rising, the reader has been guided through 6 circuits of consciousness and now stands at the gateway to truly transpersonal awareness. The neurogenetic circuit opens the possibility of identifying with the species, the planet, and the evolutionary process itself, not as poetic metaphors, but as lived realities. Wilson's challenge to the reader is direct. Will you remain trapped in the circuits of survival, status, language, and social conformity? Or will you step into the evolutionary adventure of becoming a conscious participant in life's unfolding? The Seventh Circuit offers no guarantees, no fixed doctrines, and no final answers, but it opens the door to a vast, interconnected, and ever-changing reality where the individual self becomes a creative expression of the evolutionary process itself. And so, we arrive at this threshold. 10 circuits of consciousness decoded, 10 layers of human experience illuminated. From the animal instincts of survival and status to the expansive realms of metaprogramming and evolutionary memory, Robert Anton Wilson has taken us on a journey not only through Prometheus Rising, but through ourselves. But the adventure doesn't end here. What we've uncovered so far is only the beginning, a map of the human nervous system's potential, showing us how programmed we are and how programmable we can become. And yet, beyond this lies an even more mysterious territory. Circuits of cosmic consciousness, quantum awareness, and transcendence that promise to change not just your understanding of the self, but of reality itself. In the next episode, we'll dive into chapters 11 through 18, the highest circuits in Wilson's model, where space-time itself dissolves, and the human nervous system becomes a gateway to dimensions most have never even dreamed of. If what you've learned so far has challenged your assumptions, questioned your reality, and opened your mind, prepare yourself. What's coming next will shatter all remaining limits. This is only part 1. Prometheus is still rising. Stay tuned, because part 2 will take us where very few dare to go.